So the Bernie Sanders surge continues, this time in Texas. A couple of weeks ago, I did cover a poll from Texas which showed Bernie Sanders on the upward trend, but still in second place to Joe Biden. This new poll today from Texas Tribune has Bernie Sanders in first place in one of the biggest states in the United States, one of the biggest delegate hauls on Super Tuesday, which is just a few weeks away. And it's the sort of state that if Bernie Sanders can win, fundamentally shatters the narrative about how Bernie Sanders is only a candidate for the liberal elite bubbles of the Northeast and the Northwest. Let's take a look at the numbers. Here you see Bernie Sanders at 24 points. He's only a couple ahead of Biden at 22. Warren at 15, Bloomberg at 10, Buttigieg at 7, no one else above 5%. And if you look at the movement, because the movement is what matters, you can see that Bernie Sanders is up 12, which combined with a 1-point decline from Joe Biden means that there's a 13-point swing between the top two candidates. The only other significant movement here is for Bloomberg, who was added to this poll since the last time it was done, and so he enters this poll at 10%. This shows very clearly that Bernie Sanders is on the move. Now, in this poll, it has to be recognized that Bernie and Biden are within the margin of error. But this is showing that in some southern states that are seen as conservative, that are the sort of states that you might expect Joe Biden or a moderate candidate to run away with relative to Bernie Sanders, that's not the case. That if this poll is accurate, on Super Tuesday, it could very well be the case that Bernie Sanders comes out of Texas with the most delegates of anyone in the field. And it's also encouraging because it does show Joe Biden slipping here as well. Not as much as he's slipping in the national polls and as he slipped in Iowa and New Hampshire, but he is on the downward trend. And encouraging as well is that Michael Bloomberg, while added to this poll, isn't at 17, 18, 19% close to Bernie and Biden. He's down more around 10%, showing that Michael Bloomberg, while having some encouraging numbers, isn't necessarily having a big impact everywhere in the Super Tuesday states, which is where he's tried to make that impact because he sort of ignored the first four states. He's not really playing for delegates in Iowa, New Hampshire, Nevada, South Carolina. He's been focusing on the later states because he entered the contest later, and his whole gamble was, well, I'm going to spend a lot of money on TV ads and campaign infrastructure in the later states while everyone else is preoccupied financially and logistically with winning the first four contests. That might be working in some polls, but it's not working here, given that he's all the way down at 10 points, likely below the delegate viability threshold. So all in all, this shows that Bernie Sanders is indeed the national frontrunner. He doesn't have to run away with every state in every poll to be that national frontrunner, because for Bernie Sanders to be leading, if only by a couple, in Texas, is still a sign that he is building a diverse and broad coalition that can win and compete everywhere. And this is likely due in part to the fact that Bernie does very well with young people. Bernie Sanders is also extremely competitive with Latinos and Latinas. And of course, Texas has a very large Latin American population. That's likely helping Bernie Sanders in this particular contest. But it's not just about the Democratic primary. As we've seen in some other polls, the narrative about Bernie Sanders having limited appeal nationally isn't necessarily true. One of the arguments you'll hear from neoliberals, I covered it yesterday, with the Beat Bernie 2020 PAC that's been created by shadowy folks to try to stop Bernie, is that once he gets to the general election, he's going to get trounced by Trump because he doesn't have appeal beyond the hardcore liberals and the hardcore progressives. But this poll shows that Bernie Sanders is the best poised to defeat Donald Trump. He's within 2 points of Trump. Only Bernie and Yang could claim that. This poll was done before Yang dropped out. Those are great numbers for Bernie, great numbers for Yang in terms of his ability over the long term to build a political career. But what it shows is that Bernie Sanders is within striking distance, within the clear margin of error of beating Donald Trump in Texas. Now, in this poll, Trump beats all the main Democrats. He beats everyone. But he beats Bernie by the lowest amount. And if you're a Democrat in a presidential election and you're within 2 points of the Republican, you'll take that. You'll take the opportunity on election day to have a chance at winning Texas. And right now, it's Bernie Sanders more than anyone else that's giving you that chance to win those electoral college votes in Texas. And again, the way the map always works is that there's certain assumptions. The Democrats will carry these states. The Republicans will carry those states. And at the end of the day, like 5 or 6 states often determine the whole contest because those are the swing states. States like Florida, states like Ohio, states like Pennsylvania. It's not always the same states, but those are sort of the ones that always factor in. But if Texas goes Democrat, then the whole math changes, right? Because Texas is a key Republican state, and it has a very, very high amount of electoral college votes. So if the Democrats under Bernie Sanders, and again, under Bernie, it's more likely than anybody else, can win Texas, then they'll be in an excellent position to defeat Donald Trump and bring in a progressive president to the White House. And one final note here, because this sort of goes back to the Democratic question, and it revolves around the idea that Bernie Sanders can't build a winning coalition of Democrats to unite them to face Trump. And one of the arguments is Bernie's too divisive, that Bernie may well win the primary. He may well win the nomination, but it's only because everyone else is divided. That because people are split between Warren, Klobuchar, Buttigieg, Biden, Bloomberg, that none of them will unite fast enough to defeat Bernie. And it'll be too late for the moderates to have all gotten together, even though more people wanted a moderate than a progressive to be the nominee. But this poll in Texas shows that Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, to be fair, have extremely high levels of favorability and low levels of unfavorability. Bernie is at the top of the list with Warren here, indicating that while some Democrats will be unhappy with Bernie Sanders if he's the nominee, it'll be among the lowest amount of Democrats, and he'll have nearly 70% of people viewing him favorably. Bernie is objectively popular relative to almost everyone else in the field, and the only one in a similar level is Elizabeth Warren, who has the same favorabilities, but a little bit lower unfavorability. What that's showing is that Bernie Sanders and Warren, who's often seen as the second most left-leaning person in the race, are the two most favorably viewed people by Texas Democrats. That's a good sign for Bernie Sanders, and it's a rebuke of the argument from the neoliberal media that, just megazording Biden and Buttigieg and Klobuchar and Bloomberg together equals a moderate that beats Bernie Sanders. Because clearly, when you ask the average Democrats in Texas, one of the more conservative states relative to the national scene, they find that Bernie and Liz are the two most preferred candidates. Another great poll for Bernie Sanders. We can't stop pushing. This is just one poll. Super Tuesday is a big, complex race. Bernie Sanders still needs to win the ground game to get every one of those people that said they were going to vote for Bernie to the polls. But if Bernie Sanders can win Texas, defeating Joe Biden and the rest of the field, it will be one of the single biggest narrative busters about what Bernie Sanders can do and who belongs in Bernie Sanders' diverse and broad coalition. And that's the sort of win that will carry him to the nomination. And given what we see in this poll, it may well allow him to carry Texas for the Democrats in November.